Moving on, again one of the most awaited sessions titled as Sadhguru, More Than a Life. And as the author for this session, we are delighted to have Arundhathi Subramaniam ji with us. जोरदार तालियां उनके स्वागत के लिए होनी चाहिए. Including the best-selling biography of a mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life. I would request everyone to please clear the passage. Yes. Arundhati ji has written poetry and prose, including the recent poetry volume and Love Without a Story. Yes. Make shake. Audible to all? Yes? Okay, great. So, I was telling you about our author. She has written poetry and prose, including the recent poetry volume, Love Without a Story, and book of essays on contemporary women on sacred journeys. She is the recipient of various awards and fellowships, including the Sahitya Akademi Award, the inaugural Khushwant Singh Prize, the Raza Award for Poetry, the Zee Women's Award for Literature, and the International Piero Bigongeri Prize in Italy and more. मैं चाहूँगा जोरदार तालियों से हम उनका इस मंच पे स्वागत करें, अभिनंदन करें. As the discussant, we are delighted to have Dr. Seema Raizada with us. जोरदार तालियां उनके लिए भी. She is a professor of English at Maharani Lakshmi Bai Government Girls Postgraduate College, Bhopal, a Shakespeare scholar who has her PhD and Doctorate of Literature on the works of Bard and has also authored a book titled Double Vision of Shakespeare. She is also a research guide and a subject expert to many institutions. She is also the founder of Club Literati, which is an exclusive platform for both established and budding writers and artists, and for all those who love to explore literature and creative arts. So I would request them to please ignite this session, and मैं चाहूँगा जोरदार तालियों से हम उनका स्वागत करें, अभिनंदन करें.
Welcome to the festival, Arundhati, and it's a pleasurable yet a very daunting task to be talking today to you. Why? Because we'll be talking about life with certain shades that get you to become a writer, a poet initially, and turning into a seeker. Life of Arundhati, as I see through this book, is one of quest, in search. And she traces the life of Sadhguru, tracing some milestones in his life. Life for all of us, Arundhati ji, I feel, has a pattern. And as we grow up and evolve, if we are fortunate enough to, then when we look back, we find a kind of a design, a kind of a pattern on the carpet of life. And then when we join the dots, we say this is what probably is designed for us. There is a hand of God behind whatever we see and do in life. And then finally, probably, we also agree with the famous Shakespearean cliche, all the world's a stage and we men and women mere players. And having said that, when we see ourselves as people who have come into this world to perform our duties, the kind of roles that we do. And then, you being a literature student and a poet to begin with, you would probably also agree with this fact that when we talk about a play, we also have a kind of a structure, a graph, which shows that when we come into this world, that's like exposition. And there'll be some literature students and scholars here who would know that as the play progresses, there is a rising action, then the climax, and then there's a falling action, and then the denouement or a resolution. Incidentally, one of your chapters talk about that. So, Arundhati ji, now you need to tell us, at this stage of life, at this stage of accomplishment, how do you see this pattern in life with the kind of, if you see yourself evolved, come to this point from a point when you were a writer?
Thank you. Thank you. It feels wonderful to be here. It's a terrific space. And I really can't think of a happier conversation really to be having around a book that was written over a decade ago, but a book that still remains very important to me. If I were to think about patterns, I'd say this. I'd say I was not a poet who became a seeker, which is what your question suggests. I think I was always a seeker, seeker at large for many years, since my childhood really, when I look back on some of the, thankfully, none of the writing has survived, but if I were to look back on some of the writing I did at the age of 10 and 11, I realized the preoccupations have stayed the same. The whole business of living and dying and pain and what's it all about? Where does this all go? Why are we here? I think those questions have just endured. For many years, I believed that the answers to those questions would come through poetry and the arts. I had an early fascination with dance. Poetry as a kind of verbal dance always appealed to me. The joy of kinetic language always appealed to me. And so I stayed with poetry for many years, believing that would be quite adequate, until I was plunged into a phase which happened around 1997, a phase of a kind of wordlessness. And as I started emerging from that, about a week into that phase, when I started emerging from it, the one thing I knew was that I was no longer a seeker at large, that I was really a desperate seeker. No longer would books of philosophy be adequate. No longer was just poetry adequate. I wanted more. And so I became a somewhat fevered seeker. There were 7 years after that of urgent quest. And then in 2004, I happened to walk into a South Mumbai auditorium where Sadhguru was giving a talk. And that was the beginning of another kind of journey. I had questions then, and I felt this could possibly be someone who would address those questions. I would say sometime after that, I became a committed seeker. Poetry returned to me after that phase of wordlessness. So poetry has been a constant. But what has changed, I think, is the way I write poetry. That has definitely changed. The how has changed much more than the what.
So, from a poet to the seeker, this is the kind of the change that you probably felt in yourself. But you mentioned your first
No, I'm
interaction.
in fact saying it's not from a
change.
poet to
Yeah,
a seeker.
change.
I'm saying the two went hand in
Yes.
hand. And
Yeah.
I don't see the two as very different, really.
Right. So that is the poetry that's coming to that point. The poetry that I see in this book. And Arundhati talked about the first interaction, the first time you saw Sadhguru in this book. And I find it's very lyrically described. Can I just read the few lines? This is from the book. When she sees that I was struck by this man seated with easy grace, and then you mentioned the next paragraph. I particularly liked the democratic tenor of his talk, his refusal to mystify the mystical, his refusal to see any divide between the material and the spiritual, the profane and the sacred. Every human being is a spiritual. The only choice you have is between your being spiritual consciously or unconsciously. Do you want to walk with your eyes closed or open? That is the question. So this is something that you have written here. At the same time, I would like now you to tell us a little more about what you say in the introduction. Arundhati mentions here, like so many others, I have spent much of my life wanting to know. And then you also add that life that has always been exciting, precarious, and countercultural. Now, in your quest to discover yourself, in this quest to maybe to prepare yourself to see yourself in that role of a seeker, it's a very vivid description in the book how when you reach the turning point, on the train. And when I say this turning point on a train, there was a turning point in the life of Sadhguru also on the Chamundi Hills. Now, this turning points in life, when we are faced with something which is very important called choice. So when you got confronted with that particular moment when you have to make a choice. So how do you see this very, there's a very fine balance, which is what probably one can lose or can maintain that?
The turning point that I talked of earlier, and which is the one that you mentioned now, is what happened in the year 1997. I think before that, to go back to the book, the very first line of this book is, I thought gurus happened to other people. I really believe they did. For people like me, I believed it was going to be about books and perhaps a psychotherapist, conversations in cafes, theaters, bookshops. That was my life in Mumbai. And it still remains an important part of my life. But what I did discover after the 97 experience was that I could forget it at my own peril. That for me was really the realization that I emerged with. I could continue with my life like nothing had happened. And in fact, I found it ironic many years later when a journalist wrote an article about my work entitled Poet Interrupted. I found that funny, really, because it wasn't a poet who was interrupted. If anything, I believe that the poetry deepened as a result of the journey. But that wasn't how it was mapped. That was not how it was planned. All I did know is that at this point in my life, books were not enough. I needed live guidance. And 7 years followed of thrashing and flailing and floundering. And I think for many people, spiritual journeys happen in different ways. Each of us has a story, and each of us has our own turning point, some of which are still to happen. Sometimes, perhaps in some other cases, they've already happened. For me, it was absolutely necessary, given my journey. I needed live guidance at a point in time. And for all those who are allergic to the idea of the guru, as I was at one point, I'd say this. I'd say that the guru is not a figure that demands or even asks for any kind of servility from your side. I think the reason I was allergic to the idea of the guru is because I believed devotion meant servility. I believed it meant bowing and scraping and groveling. And I believed that it was a hierarchical relationship, a very hierarchical relationship between the leader and the led. That was not my experience. So I think what changed for me at 97 was that I was willing to take guidance from any quarter from which it came. That's how desperate I was. And when I met Sadhguru, the gratitude for that presence in my life at that time was immense. And that gratitude remains. Did that turn me into from a skeptic into a believer? No. No. That is not how I map my journey. And that's not the journey of the book either. The book, it took me a long time to write this book because I had to find a tone for this book. A tone of inquiry as well as a tone of wonder. For me, that wonder is the mainstay of poetry. And if I lost that wonder, I would lose everything really that mattered to me. So I wouldn't have embarked on this book had it not been for that wonder and gratitude that began the journey. But I wouldn't have written this book if I didn't have questions. I had plenty of questions. Those questions, some of them have fallen away and some of them remain. So the skepticism also remains. The doubts also remain. The wonder also remains. The respect also remains. And I think this is in some ways what I would like to talk a little more about, because in my own journey as a seeker, I was rescued time and again, not just by living presences, but also by those long gone. And the presences that rescued me often were the bhakti poets. The bhakti poets of the subcontinent, whom I retrieved for myself as my literary ancestors all over again when my spiritual journey took on a certain urgency, was simply because they reminded me that it is possible to have every kind of relationship with the divine, or with the sacred, or with the profoundest dimension of yourself, however you choose to describe it. They reminded me that everything was possible, nothing was transgressive, nothing was taboo, that it was possible to long for your God, it was possible to quarrel with your God, that it was possible to rage at your God, to throw a tantrum in verse and call it a poem, that is the Nindastuti. It is possible to make love to your God, and it is possible to dismiss your God, but you might be dismissed as well in the process. You never know which is going to happen first. They long to eat their God, and sometimes they're eaten by their gods. But what they reminded me of again and again was really that it is a relationship of such intimacy that every tone is permissible. So you're not turning from skeptic into believer, you're both. You're this and that. And it's fine. So I think it helped me realize that faith itself is a journey that is potholed by doubt. And that's okay.
Yes, so it was not a very clear transition from doubt to faith. It was, I mean, your doubts, as you say, they still remain with you. And
Some
the faith,
do.
yes. So coming to you know, your you call Sadhguru as a live roadmap, right? And the Sadhguru contagion. So something that, you know, when you started writing the book, now coming to the book, the kind of the beginning, you know, when you started writing about Sadhguru, your association with the Isha Center, and you kind of the entire gamut of your experience of the spiritual connection, the connect. Now, as you got your guru, you know, you had the access to your guru, the spiritual content in you prior to this was there. But when you had a very official or kind of a formal shishya kind of a, you know, a place, a point where you knew that you would be in association with Sadhguru, did spirituality change, some meaning of spirituality for you change?
That's a good question. At the same time, I'd say that there's really nothing like spiritual content, you know. As I said, even in terms of the poetry, I'm still writing about the same things. I'm still writing about cities and love and death and war and relationships and gender politics and all of that. That still remains. It's the how that changes. So I don't believe that the spiritual is really about content at all. And what did change, if your question is what changed when this journey began to unfold after I met Sadhguru, I'd say that I perhaps hoped at the start that I would turn into this marvelously tranquil person. I always aspired to be one, and it felt like it would be wonderful to ooze serenity. But nothing really prepared me for the fact that I was plunged into a place of such, what seemed like disruption, really. Yes. You know, so I actually sum it up in a poem that I wrote at the time, in a line from a poem, in which I say it was a bit like opening the coffee percolator and finding the roof flying off. Wow. That's how it felt. Crazy. Right. Crazy, terrifying, but real. And I think that's when one needs guidance.
So just as we find, you know, in your one of the chapters is also titled "From the Motorcyclist to a Mystic." Now, coming to the aura of Sadhguru, we all know Sadhguru as a very unconventional guru. You know, this is how we know him. And a person, you know, with a flowing beard and a shawl and the kind of, you know, very, very unique sense of humor or wit, as you would call it. So the entire persona of Sadhguru, you know, has been very fascinating. So, I mean, you have had the chance to sit with him, talk to him about the life that he had and the kind of transition he had, and finally. So now the very persona of Sadhguru and the environs of the Isha Center, how do you look at it? I mean, again, when we talk of Isha Center, the popularity of Sadhguru is immense. And we know, I mean, we have people from all over the world visiting the center and being in meditation. So how, I mean, do you think the popularity of Sadhguru has made difference to the atmosphere in any way? Especially as I mentioned, you know, when the kind of meditation and the concern for other socially important issues, I would say nationally important issues, are taken up by Sadhguru. So is there any shift that you have seen from maybe early 20s to now in 2 decades?
At the time I wrote the book, it was 2006 when I started, when he suggested I begin. I finished it in 2010. And he was big, but certainly nowhere as well known as he is today. And I think there are many who have encountered Sadhguru on YouTube, largely. But the book also played its role, I think, in touching people. I've known people who've come to the yoga center after having read the book, several, and I still get messages from some of them. I will say this, that there is Sadhguru, the persona that you describe, unconventional, witty, flamboyant, irreverent, which is what I particularly liked at the start, very irreverent, funny, light, the ability to make light of the most profound aspects of life without in any way losing that profundity. And yet, the spiritual journey itself is not about becoming a fan. I think this is important to remember, because there are many who encounter Sadhguru. I meet lots of young people who encounter him on YouTube and then feel the need to, of course, to declare themselves followers or to come to the ashram, and it's wonderful that they feel inclined to do that. But as a journey deepens, it has to mean more than fandom. Discipleship and fandom are two different things entirely. And I think often the two are confused. So the one thing that I never wanted to be was an acolyte. I didn't want to be a groupie. I didn't want to be an uncritical follower. And at the same time, I do regard myself as someone who is deeply grateful for Sadhguru's spiritual guidance. I consider him to be my guru. I don't consider myself to be his fan. I consider myself to be a somewhat blemished, somewhat imperfect practitioner of yoga, and someone whose life has been transformed by it. So I cannot forget the enormity of that and of that gratitude. At the same time, it hasn't, I think, turned me into someone who's just preoccupied by all those external aspects of him, which are wonderful, and some of which I talk about in the book, because the book is an invitation in some way to something deeper. So yes, there is the mischievous, boyish Sadhguru. There is the Sadhguru, this remote and utterly formidable figure in the advanced programs, silence programs like Samyama. And there is Sadhguru of the initiation, when he's actually present at a consecration, which is a very different Sadhguru. And there is the Sadhguru with whom you can have a heated debate, as I often have. But a spiritual journey is really about moving from personality to presence. And I think that has been, for me, the learning experience, that you don't cling to the personality of the Guru. You are actually being invited to experience the presence, which, as your journey deepens, becomes the fragrance of your own presence, and you really don't know where one ends and the other begins, and the gratitude for that is enormous. So I make many distinctions for myself personally. One is between personality and presence, and the other distinction I would make is between a spiritual organization and a spiritual process. The two often come together. Personality and presence often converge. Spiritual organization and spiritual process often converge, but they are not synonymous. You need to know when to disengage the two as well. And if a spiritual journey is a journey of freedom, then it has to be a journey that makes you more yourself, not more a clone of someone else. And I think that is an authentic journey. I think that is an authentic journey, and that is the journey to which I felt invited by my Guru.
Just an extension of what you mentioned about Sadhguru. The two different aspects of his life, so very beautifully brought out in the book. The initial, before he, was initiated into the, kind of a spiritualism. Now, when you meet him, when you were writing this book, I think, and you wrote you co-authored the book with him, the Adi Yoga. So one of the very, I think, envious position to be in, to be co-authoring the book with him. So when you were writing, when you were gathering content for the book, did you ever have to, I won't call it a struggle, but yes, some kind of disagreement with the kind of the two phases of his life, the oppositions that did you ever notice any opposition between what he was earlier and what he is now, while writing this book and also while co-authoring the book with him, Adi Yoga?
My own understanding of Sadhguru is, although it makes for a good chapter title, there's alliteration involved when you say motorcyclist to mystic. The fact is he's not ceased to be that motorcyclist. And so I don't think it's really about him changing from one to the other. I don't think it's quite that, as much as something happened to him that was enormous and which changed his life forever. But all the other things that make Sadhguru who he is, and whom he probably was even before that experience, a great contagious appetite for life, for one, the sense of humor, the irreverence, I think that was part of him even earlier. So those, in some ways, were seeming contradictions, which are not really contradictions at all. And I think that's what strikes me again and again in my interactions with him. It's been this combination of great dynamism and great stillness that he embodies all at once, and which I'm which I sometimes found difficult to navigate when we had interactions over the books. And there is also the spirit of adventure, a kind of daredevilry that she talked of in the motorcyclist persona. So there is the abandon, and there is also this razor-sharp awareness, which is also very much part of who he is.
Razor-sharp intelligence also, I think you mentioned.
Intelligence, but I'd say awareness, because that's not even about, I'm not just talking about cerebral activity. I'm talking about a capacity to be aware.
Yes.
मैम डिस्टर्ब करने के लिए माफी चाहूँगा.
Yeah, that's one last.
काफी लोग आपसे बातचीत करना चाहते हैं, सवाल पूछना चाहते हैं.
So one last question to her. So from, being a Shishya, how do you look at yourself? I mean, Shishya on the one hand, and Arundhati the Shishya, and Arundhati the, as a person, as an individual, as a mother or a wife or a sister.
I'm not a mother, but I'm also a poet, and that remains, as I said, the poetry and the quest go hand in hand. They're both about trying to come to terms with uncertainty. They're both about trying to come to terms with question marks, with commas. That's the business of my trade. Punctuation, language is what I work with. And I have a newfound respect for commas, for pauses.
So very well put. Yes, Siddharth, we can take questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Yes, right there. अच्छा, हमारे पास वक्त थोड़ा सा कम है, तो क्वेश्चंस प्लीज प्रिसाइज रखिएगा. हम आशा करेंगे कि जवाब भी प्रिसाइज रहें. प्लीज.
Hi, Arundhati. I think you talked about it, but I think this is a question which a lot of people might have in the audience is, what do you do if you can't find the guru? Because all of us think that we are spiritual and that we have a spiritual path and that's taking us in some direction, but we may not have one guru. So what is your advice in that situation?
I won't presume to give advice, but from what I understand, all one can do is deepen the longing. Deepen the longing. Something usually opens up.
Okay, next question,
And
please.
I will just add, as the mic makes its way there, that gurus often come in guises that you're unprepared for. So I was not prepared to have a guru look the way Sadhguru did. I had a very different image in my mind of the kind of guru that I would get. It didn't happen that way, but it's a wonderful, happy surprise.
Thank you.
Namaskar, Arundhati and Seema. So, myself, Dr. Sonal Mehta, I consider myself a privileged soul to be blessed in person by His Holiness Dalai Lama and Sadhguru. In fact, I went to Kailash Mansarovar Yatra with the revered Sadhguru. So my question, as Seema started with life patterns, like every individual has a life pattern. My question is how to identify that pattern. जब हम गंगा सागर में आखिर में मिलते हैं, वहाँ से लाइफ पैटर्न आइडेंटिफाई करके वहाँ तक जाने की जर्नी कैसे आइडेंटिफाई करें?
Thank you for the question, but I will say that usually change happens, transformation happens when patterns are disrupted. So it's a good idea not to get too attached to any pattern,
Thank you. We'll take one last question from the back. Anyone from the back who has a question? वहाँ पे please. Yes, पीछे. Last question for the session.
My question is, between reverence and irreverence, many gurus, I would not say Sadhguru in particular, they demand reverence from their followers, but in their own persona, they are very irreverent. So how does one reconcile being a follower and joining the group and the irreverent self that the guru takes for himself?
Yes, so I will say that I never felt any demand was made on me to be reverential. This I was very grateful for. I'll just answer the question as briefly as possible. I think somewhere between chest thumping and groveling, there is another way to reclaim your spine. And for me, this is what yoga is about. It's not about becoming a lackey, and nor is it about fueling your own intellectual arrogance and saying, I have all the answers. It's about actually acknowledging one's bewilderment, being open to surprise, and at the same time, learning that this is a journey about becoming you, yourself, not a journey about mimicking anyone else. To that extent, it is really about discovering what an original you are. Really, what an incredible possibility you are. I would say trust any guru whose journey leads you in that direction. Otherwise, don't trust such a guru whose journey leads you away from that. This is a journey of deepening responsibility for your own life. It is not a journey about sitting around looking vacant and clapping for someone else. That's not what it's about. It's about becoming your own person.
Thank you so much, Arundhati ji and Seema ji. I would like to invite to the dais the director, Raghav Chandra ji, to please come forward and present a memento as a symbol of our respect and love for the author and for the discussant as well on behalf of the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival 2023. There it is. This picture happens to be the mascot of the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival 2023. A picture of a highly endangered bird called lesser florican. मैं चाहूँगा जोरदार तालियां होना चाहिए. तालियों से हम अपना आभार व्यक्त करते हैं अरुंधति जी का for sharing such valuable thoughts with us. और साथ ही में हम आभार व्यक्त करते हैं डॉक्टर सीमा रायजादा जी का भी for being a wonderful moderator for this session. जी तालियां होती रहनी चाहिए.